Thank you. Good morning. My name is Sarah Cahill-Lanigu. I'm the editor-in-chief of Axios, a U.S. news publication. I'm thrilled today to be moderating today's discussion, really important discussion, a global discussion here at the World Economic Forum about the future of industrial policies. We'll have perspectives here from around the globe, from private industry, from government, from academia, here to present a number of perspectives about some very pressing issues. I want to welcome all of you who have joined us here this morning. And for those of you who are watching us streaming online and want to join the conversation, I welcome you to use the hashtag WEF23. We'll go ahead and begin. I want to set the stage and talk about why we're here to discuss the global disruptions that are really forcing change upon global industry. As you all know, in the news, you've seen the headlines of the last few years about COVID, of course, the pandemic, really disrupting supply chains, forcing technology into hyperspeed, and all of the, of course, the war in Ukraine, further disruptions with rising prices. This is all forcing a discussion about what needs to change and what needs to happen in global cooperation for a global industry going forward. I want to start by introducing my guests here with me to join this conversation and add their perspectives. I'll introduce each of them. Starting here on my right, Mr. Dimitri de Vries. He's co-CEO of DSM, a Netherlands-based conglomerate in many lines of business. Next to me is Her Excellency, Ms. Lee Young. She's Minister of SMEs and Startups in South Korea. On my left is the Right Honorable Grant Shapps. He is Secretary of State for Business, Energy, and Industrial Strategy of the UK. Welcome.
Thank you.
And Mr. Gerd Muller as Director General of the United Nations Industrial Development Organization in Vienna. He'll be joining us shortly. And finally, last but not least, Mr. Ricardo Hausmann. He's founder and director of the Growth Lab at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Welcome. So welcome to all of you. Wonderful. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to start with you, Mr. de Vries. You run a major corporation that's involved in many lines of businesses. From what I understand, your company is reliant upon and involved in many parts of the supply chain for many goods that move around the world. I want to start with you. What are today still the biggest challenges that you see affecting manufacturing and industry in particular in the global context?
Well, that's a huge question, and as we speak, we're still struggling with it. Let's go back in terms of concept. So supply chains and manufacturing were engineered to be extremely efficient. Nobody wanted to take any money or stock or capital tied up. So it was a very smooth engine. And that was completely disrupted by COVID, by political tensions, geopolitical tensions. And basically, in the value chain, everybody took a sort of a buffer. And as we speak today, the question is, how does that look for the future? Because at the end of the day, there's a cost to it. And the question is, who is paying for it? So consumers don't want to pay extra, certainly not in the cost inflation environment. Governments don't feel it as being their responsibility for efficient supply chains, and correctly so. The industry in itself is coping with it because there is a price to be paid. So all the choice about geopolitical production, who pays the price, what is exactly the smooth entrance in terms of supply chain is still running as we speak. And there's a lot of turmoil. I've been in many panels about that question, and there's no golden solution yet.
Mm-hmm. And for your business in particular, what do you think is the most particular issue you're still dealing with now that hasn't fully shaken out?
Yeah. So we have made a choice ourselves what type of products are essential for the world. So we are in the health nutrition business, so we supply medical nutrition, we supply multivitamin ingredients. And there are some products in the world where you just cannot live without. And there the supply chain needs to be completely different than products which are nice to have. And I think we are making that choice, but it's a joint responsibility, and that's also why I'm in a panel for industrial policy. It's not only our responsibility to make that choice, but it's the world to make that choice.
Mm-hmm. And I want to turn to get the government perspective from you, Secretary Shapps, about what the UK, what has been clear to government about where the gaps are between business, where government can fail to ensure a certain stability.
Yeah, I mean, we've experienced, as the whole world has, these kind of supply chain shortages, and they crop up in all sorts of unexpected ways. So just over a year ago, we had queues at our petrol stations, something unimaginable, unthinkable. There's always petrol at the pump if you needed to go and get it. And actually the problem wasn't anything to do with petrochemicals. The problem was to do with the lorry drivers, the HGV drivers, the truck drivers, the tanker drivers, to get the petrol to the right place from the refinery, which had plenty of petrol, to the station. And so in terms of a government response, I mean, it clearly the supply chain is a commercial issue to resolve, and we've seen these enormous movements on a broader front. For example, the classic measure can be the cost of a container from China to Europe, or China to the US, to North America. And we saw that go sky high and then fall to a tenth of its height now. Mm-hmm. Government isn't going to be able to fix that, but what government can do is the regulatory changes that might be necessary to help sort of grease the wheels of commerce. So going back to the tanker driver shortage and the queues at petrol or gas stations, what I did was introduce 22 different specific measures to essentially loosen some of the bureaucracy around, what does it take to become a tanker driver? Why is it that when you take your driving test, you have to first learn to drive a rigid truck and then a elongated one, and you have to allow a certain number of weeks in between. And I discovered this came from some EU law, and we're not in the EU anymore, so I didn't have to worry about that. And I was able to, without lessening the standard of the test, just take away the bureaucracy. And that was just one measure. There were 21 other measures. Using regulatory freedoms and being more flexible enabled us to resolve the problem faster, I think, than some other locations in the world were able to do. So I think the government has to kind of be really creative and in particular work on the regulatory side of things.
But aren't you also re-examining your global alliances, right? The US is, we're having an energy crisis here in Europe. It's maybe not as bad as people feared, but rethinking the world and how goods move around it, it's got to be top of mind. So
one of the interesting things, in a British context, is at the same time, we'd recently come out of the EU at this particular moment in time. So people were sort of apt to say, well, hasn't this just happened because you don't have free movement of people? But actually, it transpired that they had even bigger shortages of tanker drivers in this particular instance, say in Poland and France and Germany. Everyone was suffering. So the global coordination wasn't so much the issue, but the issue that the world has experienced, particularly through COVID and then through the Putin's war in Ukraine, is you've got to be just a little bit more self-reliant. So how do you train people into this market? How do you make sure that your supply chain can provide the PPE equipment,
right,
if you have a pandemic? How do you make sure that energy isn't reliant on unreliable partners? So I think it has led to a greater sense that you've got to be self-reliant. But we are great global traders, and we want the world to be as open as possible as well. So I think you're right about those shifting global alliances, but it's very, very important we don't slip into protectionism. And that is where, at the edges, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US is dangerous, because it could slip into protection. That's not its intention. I don't think it's necessarily where it is going, but if it's not amended, you think it is the intention. You say, yeah, it is protection, yes. Whether it's intentional protection or not is the debate. But I think that that is where we have to be really careful.
Yeah.
Globally. Well,
it's a good debate that's happening here. Welcome, Mr. Muller, to this. Yeah. Would you like to weigh in this? We're talking about the role for how government is rethinking and policies that should be in place given the huge disruption. We already heard from Mr. De Vries about how his company is rethinking where government should fit in or not fit in, and we welcome you to the stage.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. So, which government? Yeah. I'm the Director General for UNIDO. That's the UN Organization for Industrial Development. And we deal as a bridge between industrialized countries and developing countries, 170 members. And here in Davos, we talk a lot about consequences of these triple crises, pandemic, Ukraine, and climate change for the industrialized countries. And indeed, the industrialized countries, they react with tremendous programs to support their economies. In US, in Europe, in all industrialized countries, not with billions, with trillions. And now the question, what is the support for 2/3 of the world, for the developing countries? These countries are hit hardest by the pandemic. The first step, there was no vaccine for these countries. Climate change, who is most affected? US or Germany? No, Sudan, the Sahel region. And what is about the support for these countries? What is about the support from the G20 and the G7? Nothing, nothing. They reduced the budget for developing aid the last year. That is the reaction of the industrialized countries concerning this triple crisis.
Mr. Hausman, you've done a lot of work with the Growth Lab at Harvard and on policy. I wonder what your perspective is.
Well, I mean, I would like to live in a world where there was more support for development, but I typically work with countries that have to deal with the situations that they have. And I would like to make some interesting distinctions, I hope they're interesting in any way, on how they are thinking or they should think about industrial policies. The first one is what we call, you want to think about the intensive margin, that is, you want to think about the needs of the industries that you have, or do you want to think about the extensive margin, the attracting industries you don't yet have? So, the industries that you have can complain. The industries that you don't have don't complain and don't tell you what they need. So how do you move into new areas? Because development is all about, expanding your set of capabilities into new things. Then you want to think about, do you want broad-based subsidies like the ones that, these trillions of dollars that have been put on the table that you don't have as a developing country? Or do you want to focus more on what you might want to call the public goods, the relatively specific public goods, whether there's infrastructure, regulation, rules, like the ones that Minister Schaap was telling us about the truck drivers in Britain, right? And the 22 other measures, right? And that means that you need to have a government that has the bandwidth to focus on the many issues that many verticals are going to face, right? Number three, industrial policies have been discussed a lot, sometimes at the national level, sometimes at the regional level. Even, for example, in Britain or the US.
At the global level.
Yeah. And maybe at the global level, but
maybe.
and I think we're going to get there when we discuss climate change. But many policies are about some laggard regions, whether it's the Rust Belt in the U.S. or the North in Britain. Developing countries have the same story, that they might have parts of the countries that are developing, say around Bangkok or around Monterrey, but other parts of the place are left behind. Do you want to tilt economic development there? How do you achieve economies of agglomeration there? Then typically these countries have a complete divorce between their universities and business. The countries have converged in terms of the number of people that are going to university. University enrollment is, say in Latin America, is 90+% of US rates of enrollment, but we are at 2% patenting rates. Mm-hmm. So we've closed the gap on education. We're not closing the gap on innovation. Mm-hmm. And that has to do with structures of university policy that are divorced from structures of industrial policy. Mm-hmm. I think training is an area that some countries have figured out better than others. People are very impressed by Switzerland, Germany. But the secret there is that you use the companies themselves to train the workers, and you acknowledge the fact that they're providing a public good. By the way you treat their expenditures on training, by the way you help them in training, and by the way you certify what they've did in their training. So I think that's a huge space. And finally, I would like to mention mobility. In developing countries, the cost of going to work is a much higher fraction of income, simply because cars cost more or less the same everywhere, and gasoline costs more or less the same everywhere, but salaries are not the same everywhere. They're much lower in developing countries. That makes transportation costs much more significant. And if you have very inefficient urban development, where densities are not there and the transportation systems are not there, the cost of just going to work in terms of direct cost and time and opportunity cost, etc., makes it very inefficient to go to work and very hard for firms to attract workers, and makes them less competitive. Mm-hmm. So these are the issues that I think are on the table when you think about industrial policy.
And Mr. Hausman, you mentioned innovation and technology. I want to bring Minister Lee into the conversation in your role in supporting entrepreneurs. And new technologies have also disrupted. We saw, just a small example, really well covered in the pandemic, of mobilization of just the vaccine manufacturing, and new companies getting into everything from the development to the delivery. I want to hear the perspective from South Korea, and if our guests could please put the headphones on for Ms. Lee. Thank you.
네, 앞에서 그 공급망 교란으로 인해 가지고 각 나라가 얼마나 힘든 일을 겪었는지에 대한 설명을 주셨고, 특히 허스만 그 교수님 같은 경우는 이게 이제 개발도상국이랑 또 같은 나라를 하더라도 취약계층일수록 얼마나 피해가 심했는지를 말씀을 주셨습니다. 그 전 세계적으로 중소기업이랑 스타트업만을 위해 갖고 부처가 있는 나라는 많지 않을 것 같습니다. 근데 대한민국에서 그렇게 스타트업과 중소기업을 위한 전문 부처가 있는 이유가, 대한민국 기업의 99%가 바로 중소기업이랑 스타트업입니다. 근데 이제 공급망 교란과 관련해서 코로나도 있지만 러시아, 우크라이나 사태를 보시면 지정학적으로 한국은 굉장히 가깝게 있고요. 특히 수출과 원자재를 수입하는 곳이 중국인데 의존도가 저희가 굉장히 높습니다. 근데 코로나 기간 동안 중국이 봉쇄를 함으로 인하여서 저희 어려움이 굉장히 많이 겪었고요. 다른 나라에 비해서 또 하나의 어려움은 뭐냐면, 지금 대한민국은 초고령 사회로 진입을 해서 2025년이면 이제 아주 세계 최고의 초고령 사회로 가고 있고, 지금도 그 스피드 면에서는 최고 수준입니다. 근데 그동안 대한민국의 중소기업들은 대부분 제조기업이었고 외국인 노동자들이 들어와서 일을 하고 있었는데, 코로나 3년 동안 또 자국으로 돌아가다 보니까 실제 일할 수 있는 노동 인력이 절반으로 줄었습니다. 그래서 원자재에 대한 공급망 교란도 있었고, 지정학적으로 러시아랑 중국이 가까이 있었다라는 문제도 있고, 외국인 근로자들이 더 이상 한국에 들어올 수 없는 문제가 있다 보니까 다른 나라에 비해서 제조강국 대한민국은 2중 3중의 어려움을 겪었습니다. 그래서 이 문제를 해결하기 위해서 대한민국 정부가 결정한 것이 디지털화입니다. 그래서 실제로 원자재가 어떻게 수급이 되고 협력사들 간에 어떤 밸류체인이 있는지를 다 디지털화하기 시작을 했고요. 공장을 스마트 공장으로 전환을 하기 시작을 했습니다. 그래서 실제 인력이 부족하더라도 숙련된 그 노동자가 갖고 있는 노하우들을 다 데이터화해가지고 그것을 스마트 공장에서 생산성을 향상시키는 방향으로 했습니다. 그 외에도 저희는 스타트업이 굉장히 강한 나라입니다. 그래서 이 관련된 부분들에 대해서 기술적으로 이 부분을 극복할 수 있는지에 대해서 국가적인 지원이 굉장히 많이 갔었고요. 그래서 관련돼서 이 원자재를 직접 수급을 해갖고 원자재만으로 가는 부분을 새로운 소재를 개발한다거나 하는 방식으로 진행을 했었습니다. 그 외에도 기후변화에 대한 도전을 지금 대한민국 중소기업들은 굉장히 많이 맡고 있습니다. 근데 재생에너지를 100% 활용하고 싶은데 실제로 바람의 세기와 어떤 뭐 수력 발전 같은 것이 그 자연적인 혜택을 받고 있는 나라들에 비해서 실질적으로 실질적으로 힘듭니다. 그래서 재생에너지를 생산하는 부분을 자연에서 주는 이득 대신에 100% 기술로 지금 극복을 해야 되는 문제가 있기 때문에 지금 굉장히 많은 하이테크의 딥테크 스타트업들이 그 부분에 도전을 하고 있습니다. 특히 유럽에 이제 수출을 하려고 그러면은 탄소 중립 관련해 가지고 이제 파일럿 테스트가 시작이 됐기 때문에 그런 준비들을 또 해야 하거든요. 그래서 지정학적인 문제뿐만 아니라 이 탄소 중립에 대한 도전도 저희 중소기업들은 굉장히 많이 받고 있고 그것들을 국가가 나서서 전체 전수조사를 해서 수출 기업이 얼마나 되고 실제 수출 품목이 어떻게 되고 그중에 탄소 중립과 관련돼서 굉장히 많이 탄소를 배출하고 있는 물품은 뭐고 이런 것들을 다 디지털화하는 걸로 지금 극복해 나가고 있습니다.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that answer. And I think you bring up a good point. Many of the panelists have spoken to about climate change, and that's also a driving force. Mr. DeVries, let's go back to you. I'd love to hear about how you're addressing that and thinking about decarbonizing the process, the manufacturing, distribution. And you have many lines of business, from nutritional products to engineering materials. So I'd love to hear what changes you put in place or thinking about it.
Yeah. I think the interesting is that the whole decarbonization and climate change is a joint effort because it's such a complex problem that you can't just have a monodimensional view. So that's also why I like these type of discussion because it needs governments, it needs consumers, it needs the industry to make that work. So I think first and foremost we need to agree that we have different roles to play. So I think governments need to set the box within we can play. And then within that box, companies like ours need to play. Certainly in a transition where we go to more climate action, where there's a carbon price, where you price waste in the right way, I think governments have a huge role to play because they need to set the box right. But they should not play in that box. For instance, today, even today, fossil fuels are still heavily subsidized in some of the countries. Mm-hmm. So you set the box in the transition, but you also play in the box by continuing giving that subsidy. So what we should not do is, in that whole transition to a more carbon-free environment, that we continue to subsidize non-valid business models. What the governments need to do is to play the box and say, okay, if you have an industry where there are high emissions on CO2, you pay a certain price, a carbon price. I'm a strong believer in that. And that starts innovation. But in the transition, it needs to help, because we need to act and we need to work together. A nice example, we have a product which is called Bovaer, which you add to premix for cattle, for cow, and that reduces the methane emissions. So, as you probably know, cows are emitting quite some amount of methane, by the way, not from the back, but from the front. Mm-hmm. I also had to learn that. And if you add that premix enzyme, it reduces with 30 to 50%. That's a fantastic solution to help climate change. We went to the farmer and we said, listen, you need to have this fantastic product of ours, and it reduces methane. We can show it scientifically. And the farmer said, well, you offer me a product for a solution. I don't see the problem. Well, yeah, you have a problem because your cows are emitting methane. So, yeah, that's not my problem. So you should need to go to the government. So we went to the government. And the government said, okay, well, great product, fantastic, etc. But I mean, you don't need to come to us. You need to go to the farmer because it's their problem. And then we said, yeah, well, now we got stuck. We got this brilliant invention, a brilliant technology, and nobody sees there is an issue. So there we've learned that we need to engage with the governments to make sure that the farmer feels it's a problem. And then we come in, and not that we subsidize the product to make it transition. So I think it needs to be clear where we play in the box, where the governments need to set the box. And on sustainability, on climate change, we have the economic system which works pretty well. The only failure is that we don't price waste and externalities in the right way. So if there is emission on carbon, if there is emission on methane, you need to price that in the cost of your product. Mm-hmm. And I think we're in that transition. And I'm hopeful, but it can go a little bit quicker.
Uh-huh. And Secretary Shapps, any thoughts on that? And Mr. DeVries is talking about incentives here. And there's consumer incentives. I think many of us saw in our flights to, deep offset your air flight, but we're talking about larger, bigger boxes and incentives. Do you agree?
Yes, absolutely agree. I love this example with the methane product for cows. And of course, why would a farmer? You know, the farmer doesn't have any costs personally to that methane being put out there. Of course, governments have got to act. But here's the thing: a government doesn't want to act on that on its own because it will put its own farmers at a competitive disadvantage. So this has to be solved globally. And you mentioned aviation. It's a fantastic example. And there is a global effort that's called CORSIA, which is a process of essentially costing the carbon output from aviation. And as long as you do that on a global basis and everyone's in the same position and the costs are the same, then, you know, then of course it then becomes immediately interesting to switch to other things such as sustainable aviation fuel, the switch to potentially hydrogen and what have you. So in government, this has been a lot of what I've been dealing with. I'll just give you two examples. Starting with aviation, we set up something called the Jet Zero Council, and this brings together, to your point, the academics with the government, with the industrial sector, all three of them together to work on how we get to net zero flight by 2050. And we're making some significant progress. We've had the first aircraft fly on hydrogen. It was a Rolls-Royce EasyJet flight. There's an American company, but it's in Britain, called Zero Avia, working on an engine. I've gone to see it, which is going to be hydrogen operated. They're about to do their first test. In fact, the owner of that Zero Avia company is here at the World Economic Forum. The sustainable aviation fuel market is really starting to get going, and we're doing that through regulation. So the EU have said 5% of fuel by the end of the decade will have to be using sustainable aviation fuel, which at least doesn't put more carbon out there. The UK is going for a higher target. We're saying 10%. We like to lead on this bluntly so we can get the factories in the UK. The US, I suspect, will catch up on SAF now. So you start to get a world movement around the regulation that's involved. And then specifically on energy production, because in the UK we closed our coal mines, actually under Thatcher, controversially at the time, in the 80s and then a bit in the 90s. We ended up decarbonising very, very quickly. Almost none of our energy comes from coal these days, 1% maybe. But we had to find an alternative. And our alternative, 10, 12 years ago, I was in the government back then, it was under David Cameron, was to build wind farms, particularly offshore. And I remember we came up with this mechanism, the contract for difference, where we'd guarantee the price to the manufacturer, to the constructor. I just remember being in a cabinet meeting and Cameron saying, "This is crazy. This is going to cost more than nuclear power, which is traditionally an expensive form of power but extremely reliable. This is going to cost more. Well, what are we doing? Should we do this?" We made the decision a decade ago to go ahead with it. Today, in fact, literally yesterday or last week, we will have been producing 50, 60, 70% of all of our electricity from wind, mostly offshore wind. We have the world's largest wind farm, the second largest, the third largest, the fourth largest. In the next auction for contracts for differences, I've seen the bids, the scale and size of the turbines to produce the electricity are so large that the arms of the turbines, if you took 7 football pitches and put them together, that is the sweep of the turbine going round. And you put 300 of these enormous turbines next to each other. So that is brilliant, but the wind doesn't always blow, and so the sun doesn't always shine. So you still have to look for what are the other alternatives, whether it's nuclear or small modular reactors or what have you.
Right, the cost of energy is competitive, right? That's the beauty of it. So you don't need to subsidise it.
And that is
just good on its own.
Now, 10 years on from this Cameron conversation in Cabinet, now it is amongst the cheapest strike price for energy, and we no longer have to subsidise. So it's been a real achievement through getting the regulatory framework and taking a risk, it has to be said.
Yeah, and taking a long term. Right. And we're talking about crisis, but having to think long term. Mr. Hausman, Mr. Muller, what other long term thinking needs to happen here, or policies?
I think the world has benefited a lot from this focus of saying, the world needs to lower its emissions, every country needs to lower its emissions, every city needs to lower its emissions, every value chain needs to lower its emissions, and that's like a very it's been a useful way of understanding what needs to happen in order for the world to lower its emissions. But I think it leads a very, very huge chapter, and even maybe even bigger chapter, out of focus. You can ask Bolivia to say, you should lower your emissions. But honestly, if they lower their emissions to zero, no one will notice, right? They happen to be sitting on the largest lithium reserves in the world. They could do things that help the world lower its emissions. And so it's not just about what are you going to do to lower your emissions. What are you going to do to enable the rest of the world to lower its emissions?
That's it.
And that implies, for example, we will need wind farms. Where are they going to be produced? We'll need solar panels, where electrolyzers, we'll need lithium, we'll need nickel, we'll need cobalt, we'll need etc. There's a lot that needs to be produced to help the world decarbonize. So I think it's important to take the picture of how it is that this developing world, which is supposed to buy all these equipments to have green energy, how it is that they're going to help the world or provide things to the world so that they have the exports with which to import stuff. They have a role to play. And here there's an important issue about renewable energy. Renewable energy is different from oil in the fact that oil was incredibly cheap to transport. And because it was incredibly cheap to transport, the price of oil was essentially equal everywhere. And that meant that energy-poor countries could specialize in energy-intensive products. So, for example, Japan, Korea, Belgium, Germany could export steel. They don't have much energy, no problem, they bring it in. Well, bringing in green energy is much, much more expensive. We don't have the technologies to move it around. So I think what's going to happen is that the world will want to locate energy-intensive activities near green sources of energy, green sources of cheap green sources of energy. And I think that would lead to a reaccommodation of where the world produces things. And it should start producing more things close to where green energy is. And fortunately, there's a lot of sun in the tropics.
Yes.
Now we are at a point that's very important. That is great what happens in the UK, in Europe, in G20s. But net zero 2050 is only possible with a Green Deal, with investments, with new technologies in the developing countries. 2/3 of people are living there. And energy is the basic for every development, especially industrialization. And look to Africa, the African continent, 600 people do not have access to electricity. Energy, electricity, that's the first step for industrialization. And of course, the G20 are responsible for 80% of the emissions. And therefore, that is very important. Go ahead with technology and with all these messages. But the developing countries pay the price for the consequences of climate change. Again, they pay the price, and they need more solidarity. Look about this promise of 100 billion. The G20 offered 100 billion 5 years ago. Oh, and what is the reality? They paid 30 billion loans. So look at Sharm el-Sheikh, the results. There was no decision about loss and damage. And that is the situation. The developing countries need, and UNIDO is the platform for technology transfer, especially in this field of energy. Of course, they need tremendous investments in renewable energies, in hydrogen, but even in carbon capture. Because the reality is 80% of world energy today is based on fossil fuel. And it will be based the next 10 or 20 years. And there is, because of population growth, the next 20 years, the next 30 years, Africa will double. They need energy. They need jobs, hundreds of millions of jobs. And the basic is energy. And still today, In African countries, they plan coal power stations. 300 coal power stations still today are planned by big companies. And so that is the reality. The demand for energy the next 30 years worldwide will rise up about 70%, and mainly based on fossil fuel. In Nigeria, talk about with the Nigerian government, or Mozambique, that is based, energy is based on coal there. And what do they need? They need new technologies, progress by innovation, carbon capture, carbon storage, carbon usage. That we have to bring forward. And we must come to a closer cooperation, partnership between industrialized countries, emerging and developing countries in technology partnership, in sharing our knowledge. And I like, and I know, and UK is doing a lot in this field, but not so much from US. There's nearly nothing. They cut the development aid, and that is the reality too. We are here in Davos. That should be not only a discussion about what happens within the G20. There's a commitment from the industrialized countries to support the developing countries, and 2/3 of the world in the future, in the near future, in 20 or 30 years, 85% of people in the world live in developing countries. Africa will double within the next 20 years. We need answers to these questions.
Really important point. I want to make sure we're running a little bit short on time. Yes, real quick, Ms.
지금 그러니까 우리가 그 기후 변화에 적응하기 위해서 무엇을 해야 하느냐라는 얘기를 많이 했는데 지금 미스터 물러 씨가 어떻게 할 것이냐에 대한 얘기를 해주신 것 같아서 굉장히 고무적입니다. 그 대한민국이 딱 중간에 서 있는 것 같습니다. 대한민국 같은 경우는 경제 10위에 들어가는 선진국임에도 불구하고 아까 말씀드린 것처럼 중소기업이 전체 기업의 99%이고 대부분이 제조기업입니다. 그래서 탄소를 배출하는 굉장히 많은 산업군에 몰려 있다 보니까 지금 이 스케줄대로 하는 부분에 대한 도전이 굉장히 부담스러울 정도입니다. 대한민국이 자본과 기술이 있음에도 불구하고 이 탈탄소에 대해서 적응하는데 이렇게 힘들다면 대부분의 이 개발도상국 같은 경우는 이 부분이 현실성이 있냐라는 의문을 많이 하게 될 것이고, 이것이 전 지구적으로 함께 나아가야 되는 대열로 느끼는 건지 아니면 새로운 보호무역주의를 하나 만들어가지고 미리 준비한 선진국들한테 굉장히 유리한 또 다른 산업군 하나를 만드는지에 대해서는 굉장히 많은 후진국이나 개발도상국에 있는 나라들이 의문을 품고 있는 것이 사실입니다. 저희 대한민국 같은 경우는 ODA 사업도 굉장히 많이 하는데요. 관련해 갖고 탈탄소에 대한 개념도 없고 어떻게 해야 될지도 모르는 상황입니다. 한국 같은 경우도 지난 우리가 많은 정부에서 실제로 태양광에도 돈을 굉장히 많이 넣고 수력, 그다음에 풍력 굉장히 많은 돈을 넣었는데 실제로 기술적으로 굉장히 하이엔드 기술이 받쳐주지 않는 상황에서 1조량도 안 나오고 바람의 양도 없는 상황에서 시설 투자만 해가지고는 전기가 나오지를 않았습니다. 그래서 대한민국 전체가 폐허가 될 정도로 태양광을 깔았지만 실제로 1조량의 문제 때문에 다시 탈원전에서 원전으로 돌아가야 되는 상황이 있거든요. 그래서 저는 미리 탈탄소를 준비했던 이 분야의 많은 선진국들이 기술과 관련된 데이터들을 공유하면서 속도를 함께 맞추는 부분들이 굉장히 필요해야 될 것 같고요. 대한민국 같이 그 부분은 좀 늦었지만 기술적인 캐치업이 굉장히 빠를 수 있는 나라는 관련된 기술 개발을 해서 공유해 주는 것들이 필요할 것 같습니다. 그래서 언제까지라는 목표를 정해놓고 그 목표에 도달하지 않으면 국경세를 내겠다라든가 관련돼서 뭐 세금을 비롯해서 여러 가지 압력적인 요소를 하기보다는 전 지구적인 대열에 많은 나라가 참여할 수 있도록 기술과 경험과 데이터를 나누는 새로운 방식의 탈탄소 접근이 필요하지 않을까 생각합니다.
Yeah, thank you, Minister Lee, for that perspective as well. We've had such a great conversation here. I think we've run out of time. We won't have time for Q&A, but I just want to thank my distinguished panelists here we had a wide-ranging conversation, covered a lot of ground. Thank you so much for the conversation. Thank you for joining us online. That concludes this session on the future of industrial policies. Thank you very much.
Hello.